And we're also hoping that you'll leave here with some ideas, some sort of concrete ideas, but we're also hoping you'll also have kind of new frameworks. And just what we know about unconscious bias, part of what we need to do to combat it is just trigger ourselves to remember that it exists, right? And so we use this as one of those moments, but that we continue to figure out how to make it a practice, right? Which is to say strategies are a part of this, but it's really about a practice of sort of pedagogy that pays attention to this. So to get us started, I'm going to try and start with something a little more sort of fun and interactive. And I'd love you to just take a minute to chat with your colleagues at the table. Actually, let me do this. Turn to someone sitting next to you as opposed to your whole table at this point. Thank you. Introduce yourself. Say hello if you haven't already. Thanks. Something we often forget to do with our own students. All right, so after you've introduced yourself, I'd love you to chat. How to do teacher thing. Okay. As you come to a close in your introductions, this is good. It's good, we got it. All right, I know. Clap once if you hear my voice. Clap twice if you hear my voice. Clap 3 times if you hear my voice. Clap 4 times if you hear my voice. All right, there we go. So now that you've had a chance to at least briefly introduce yourselves to each other, what I'm hoping you'll do is just turn back to that partner and discuss really briefly, what are you bringing to this? Have you experienced your own bias in the classroom? Have you experienced sort of bias among your students? Are you thinking, what are you bringing to this conversation? Why are you interested in this conversation about unconscious bias? What are your curiosities around this? So just take a couple of minutes to share with whoever that partner was what you're coming here to try and understand, ways that you've encountered this question in your own teaching or in your own learning. All right, so just a few minutes to chat with your colleagues about that. Okay, so if you could sort of close this part of the conversation. Clap once if you hear my voice. Clap twice if you hear my voice. Clap 3 times if you hear my voice. Clap 4 times if you hear my voice. Clap 5 times if you hear my voice. Clap 6 times if you hear my voice. Oh, yay, we're already getting applause and we just started. Okay. And a couple of folks who might want to share something that they're bringing to this, thoughts, anything that emerged. We're going to have lots of opportunities for sharing, but want to open that up if anyone's there. Anything you talked about? What are you bringing to this? This is called wait time, also an inclusive practice. All right, Barbara, let me bring this over to you. Yes, you do. We're recording this, inclusive practice.
Just the challenge of teaching statistics while also trying to plumb the depths of unconscious bias. How can you combine the study of statistics and data with also being more aware of unconscious bias?
Yeah, I think this question around our sort of particular content areas and how they inform how we do this work is really important. Anybody else want to share something you talked about? Yeah, Maria.
So we were talking amongst the three of us here, and from the student perspective side of things, a lot of students mention that there's some sorts of biases coming up in the classroom that is emerging in the classroom, and then from faculty perspectives, sort of this unawareness, without intention, that they might be, creating that environment among the students. And so, how do you create a bridge there for more awareness among faculty so that students can obviously have a very strong and effective student learning environment?
Thanks, Maria. I think that's really, really key. And that actually moves us really nicely into this next segment. This is a short video that's going to kind of anchor this issue of bias and help us understand what it is, why it matters, and kind of illuminate to many of us how it operationalizes in so many important ways, just in terms of what we perceive and what we don't and why. And that could speak to some of these questions I think that you brought up. How could we not imagine we are biased in our teaching, but our students experience the teaching as biased? How could that actually be, right? How do we make sense of that? So I'll just turn this video on, thank you, Gorky, for just a few minutes and ask you to have that in the back of your mind. So let's do this out loud. Ready? 6, 1, 3, 7. 1, 5, 4, 0, 4, 9, 7, 2, 6, 8, 5, 3, 8, 7, 0. Thank you. I still have a problem with that baseball one every time I do this. So hopefully what you took away from this are some of these key notions, right? That we are all primed in different ways to interpret data that we see and read in our classrooms, right? We may notice some things and not notice others, right? That's our priming. Our priming is going to be different from the priming of our students, especially if our lived experiences vary widely, right? But no matter who we are, all of us have varied sets of social experiences, varied sets of social positionalities, lived experiences, right? But our primings vary. So the data that we take in and how we interpret that data and then how we respond is our sort of cultural priming, right? And that's going to inform what we do, how we do it, what we see as problems, what we see as opportunities, all of the kind of micro and broader macro decisions that we make in the class, right? So these unconscious biases, right, that's what they are. They are our tendencies towards noticing, paying particular attention to some things, not noticing, not paying as much attention to others, right? And we're doing this in our system one, our fast thinking, right? It is unconscious in the sense that it is almost beyond our, they also use implicit too, but kind of below our awareness, right? It is what our brain is doing to quickly process the multitude of information, right, that every day we've got to make sense of. And so a couple of these drivers of the unconscious biases are about our brains and about our socialization, right, and about our enculturation. And so unconscious bias on some level, what we heard in this, is necessary and adaptive. We have got to use our pre-existing frameworks about the world to make sense of the world, right? If we had to think every day about every single thing that we did and couldn't use pre-existing frameworks, we'd be exhausted. Right? So the second piece, the fluency heuristic, what we like to do is we pay more attention to information that we judge to be more true, more beautiful, more real, right? And then because of that, we often also have confirmation bias, right? This notion that we tend to reach for, favor, recall, and use new information that is more likely to confirm our pre-existing structures, right? So this is sort of what's happening in our classes. And so what that means for us is that we've got to move, in our attempts to be inclusive in our practices, we've got to move beyond our sort of good intentions to be inclusive, right? Because of the way unconscious bias works, it's simply not enough, right? What Cook-Ross, Howard Ross has done a lot of work on unconscious bias, as many of you I know in this room. But Cook-Ross indicates this. Recent studies with cognitive science point us to the conclusion that most biased decisions are not made by bad people with bad attitudes, but rather by well-intentioned people who are unaware of the internal unconscious processes that may be affecting their decision-making every day, right? So how do we go from our mission and values as an institution, right? I've put these out here, but our mission and values as an American university, right? Among them, diversity, equity, and inclusion. All of our likely personal values to support students. We're here not for the money, right? We're here because we want to make a difference, probably, right? We care in some way, right? But what is the gap then between that value system and the outcomes and the impact for our students, which, as we know, unfortunately varies widely by race, by gender identity. This is what we have. We have a lot of other data that this varies by lots of other sort of social experiences. This is also not just true for our students. This is true for our faculty colleagues. This is true for our staff. This is true for our administrators. We see a lot of variation in the sense of belonging among our colleagues here at this place. So how do we go from having this value structure to this wide variation in how included folks feel in this, on this campus, right? And we're suggesting it's not the only driver, but unconscious bias can be a key piece of that gap, and becoming more aware of that, becoming more intentional in our classrooms about using inclusive practices to interrupt those, to become aware of those, can be one way that we start to move towards more of this work. So one point I want to make before I pass this off to my colleagues is that, you know, inclusion and belonging is more than just a feeling, right? It's more than a nice thing to do. A sense of inclusion, a sense of belonging are vital for learning, right? Students don't learn as well if they don't feel as included in the classroom. This is empirically proven. This is very well supported, right, in the data. Students being engaged, students feeling a sense of belonging in our classrooms, right, but also on our campus, is tightly correlated to achievement in the classroom, right? So this is also about how we ensure not just that we all sort of feel a part of this place, and that is the right thing to do, that's vital, but also that we're achieving our goals for learning for our students. So I want to turn this over, but just before I do that, many of you may have seen the instructional triangle, which is this idea that what makes a classroom, right? So what do we mean when we say how unconscious bias operate in a classroom? Like, what does that mean? And that there's these various sets of relationships that actually sort of constitute a learning environment or a classroom, right? We have the teachers to the students to the content to the teachers, and the teachers to the content. Okay, so all of these sort of bi-directional sets of relations sort of mutually constitute what it means to have a classroom or a learning space. So these are all environments within which unconscious bias can operate and does operate, right? How do we perceive our students, right? What are the biases we're bringing to our understandings of them, their work, the quality of their work, all those kinds of things? What are they bringing to their perceptions of us, right? What about their perceptions of each other and how that creates sort of this classroom environment? Their perceptions of the content, why it was chosen, what it's saying, all right? Our decisions to include that content. All of these domains are sort of relations within which this unconscious bias moment can kind of occur, right? So as we think about how we want to intervene, what we want to do, just thinking about all of these as nodes of opportunity. But notice that the teacher is at the top, right? And that's because that's intentional, sort of from a research perspective, to indicate, right, that the teacher in large part, we're there in a position of power in the classroom, right? In terms of institutional power, right? And so we can model for our students, right? We can also make decisions about curricular content. We can frame the interpretation of that content, but that all happens in a broader context as well, in a broader environment, right? So the environment of AU, the environment of DC, the environment of broader socio-political economic conversations, right? Those are all informing also those sets of relations. But we as faculty are in this place where we have an opportunity to really actively and proactively engage in moving this forward. So I'm gonna turn to my colleague Tracy, who's gonna take us through an exercise where we start to sort of engage a little bit in understanding how our own unconscious biases may be playing themselves out in how we work.
Hi, my name is Tracy Dennis, and I'm a teacher educator. So I work with pre-service teachers, and so we do a lot of work around disrupting deficit ideologies, examining some of our biases that we have, our mental models, our beliefs, values, and assumptions about our students. So I wanted to take you through an activity that I actually have the pre-service teachers do. It's called the Cultural X-ray, and it's actually an activity where you are going to take the paper that's in the middle, the little gingerbread man, in the middle of your tables, and you're actually going to, on the outside of the little ginger person, that you're going to, on the outside, create labels to describe the behavior, appearance, and aspects of your identity that others can observe or easily determine. So age, gender, language, and then on the inside, list aspects. If you don't have one, then you can just do it on a piece of paper. So maybe turn over the plan for inclusive excellence and work on the back. There's a few. Okay. So, and if there aren't enough, maybe you can just do it on a piece of paper, like a little scrap sheet of paper. Yes, I'm waiting for the conversations to die down a little bit. Okay, so I'm gonna give you the instructions one more time. Okay, so On the outside, you're going to create labels to describe the behavior, appearance, and aspects of your identity that others can observe or easily determine. So age, gender, language. On the inside, list aspects of your identity that may not be evident to others around you. And so in the interest of time, we're just going to keep moving forward. So after the teacher candidates list the labels that are easily visible to the exterior, and they include who they really are on the inside, I let them know that what is on the exterior is often how we judge our students. We make values, judgments, we make assumptions based on what's on the exterior. But what's on the exterior is surface, shallow, and often erroneous information. And what we really need to get in order to be inclusive and help our students to the best of our ability is to get to what's on the inside, what is not visible. Because what's on the exterior is often based on biases. So, so we also do a lot of talking about the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings on culturally relevant pedagogy. And some of the main tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy is recognizing the importance of including students' cultural reference in all aspects of learning. So when we speak about cultural reference, it's probably what's going to be on the inside of your ginger person, what is not immediately visible on the exterior. The three areas that Ladson-Billings outlines in culturally relevant pedagogy is academic achievement, cultural competence, and socio-political consciousness. So these three areas, in order to successfully support and nurture all of our students and ensure that they feel validated, affirmed, and included in your classrooms, these are the three ways that successful teachers are able to accomplish this. As we look at the three areas as well, going back to the ginger person, think about some of the ways that you could validate and affirm students based on things that are in the middle of your ginger person. So not what's on the exterior, the assumptions that we make, but what is on the inside. So finding ways for students to recognize, understand, and critique current and social inequalities, that helps your class be more inclusive, helping students recognize and honor their own cultural beliefs and practices while acquiring access to the wider culture and holding high expectations for all students. one of the things that Django Paris recently in his work in 2012 talked about was culturally sustaining pedagogy. And he says that we need to change this term of culturally relevant pedagogy to culturally sustaining pedagogy so that students are not just being validated and affirmed in classrooms, and their home language and culture is not only being used as a bridge to the dominant academic language, but it is maintained and sustained. He's saying that the message, the pervasive message is still, we're gonna use your home language and culture to bridge you over and then eradicate it. But he's saying we need to sustain it and also embrace it. So I give my students, my teacher candidates, a graph. It's called culturally affirming instruction. And these are different ways that students can actually introduce their content, but also make sure that it's connected to students' cultural and intellectual legacy, it's connected to students' lived experience, connected to the students' community, and of value outside of the classroom. So sometimes people ask, well, how do I do that within my content area? And one of the things, I have like several different ways that you can actually come up with culturally affirming instruction. I actually have them do this activity. So if they are a math teacher, they have math in the middle, science teacher, English teacher, social studies teacher, and then they build out a culturally affirming instructional sequence. And one of the things, one of the ways is a research project on home language and culture. So for example, if a student is doing interviews, gathering field notes, transcribing, determining the validity of research, doing interviews, developing qualitative inquiry skills, and writing research questions, that student is learning to think and act like a researcher within the context of it's something that's connected to their lived experiences, maybe connected to their community, and of value outside of the classroom. So they're learning valid research skills and how to interview and question and all of that within the framework of culturally affirming instruction. And then this last acronym I wanted to introduce to you. Again, this is for my teacher educators, but it is actually of value and worthwhile for us as faculty. So I give them the DIVERSE acronym, and the DIVERSE acronym, how am I looking on time? Okay. The DIVERSE acronym gives different ways for effective and inclusive instructional practices. So the first one that I share with the teacher educators is having diverse instructional materials. And when I worked in the District of Columbia Public Schools, we did something called a curriculum audit where we looked at the windows and mirrors. So we looked at the demographics of our DC Public School District, and we looked at how many windows, based on the student population, how many windows they have, meaning how many opportunities they get to see other cultures and groups reflected, and how many mirrors they have, how many opportunities they get to see themselves reflected in their curriculum. So what I asked the teachers is, are all your students able to see themselves in your curricular mirror? Are all parts of the world seen through your curricular window? Are diverse thoughts, views, and people woven into the curriculum? So that's the first thing, thinking about when you want to be more inclusive, coming up with diverse instructional materials. The second, the I is for inclusive. Does your teaching provide opportunities for each student, especially those quiet students, to participate in class discussions? And how are you ensuring that every student has a voice in your classroom? Variety, using different teaching strategies, learning styles, incorporating cooperative learning, kinesthetic and artistic activities that honor student differences, not just lecture. So do you have variety in your teaching strategies to address different learning and diverse learning styles? The next E is for exploration, and that's that as teachers or faculty, we should encourage students to explore new cultures and beliefs and be open themselves to new ideas so that they can learn how different people view the world, and that's for students and faculty as well. And what's interesting is a lot of the students in my classes here at AU say that they've come from very homogeneous backgrounds, so having them incorporating exploration into your curriculum and your instruction and your lessons is going to benefit everyone in your class, and you too. And then I'll go through the last ones quickly. Reaction, giving feedback, putting time and thought into the feedback that you give students. We all know that students benefit from concrete, direct, specific feedback, and so making sure that you're giving feedback and communicating high expectations to every student in your classroom. Safety. Without a safe environment, students aren't going to be able to learn. It's very hard to learn if you don't feel safe. So as instructors, we need to shut down offensive comments about religion, race, ethnicity, or sexuality immediately in order to have an inclusive and safe classroom. And then the last one is, evaluation. So just thinking about what types of evaluations you have in your classroom. Do you have multiple methods of assessments? We know achievement tests, aptitude tests, high stakes tests are often designed for a white middle class culture. So are you incorporating projects? Are you incorporating portfolios? And how are you actually making sure that you incorporate multiple methods of assessment for your students? So this diverse acronym is what we use to kind of guide the instruction and curriculum that our teachers are actually going to implement in their classrooms. Oh, okay. Is there another? Oh, so the last, resource pedagogies and funds of knowledge. The goal is to create culturally affirming identities of excellence and counter narratives that challenge dominant ideologies. I forgot to tell you, another activity that we actually do, and you all can't see it, but it's like a foursquare. So what we do is we examine deficit ideologies of different groups of students. So I have students receiving special education services, remedial students, students of color, English language learners, and low-income students. So I have all my teacher candidates list they examine the deficit ideologies that society has about these groups of students, and they list them all on a chart paper. And what comes to mind is a lot of our students of color are disproportionately placed in special education classes, and a lot of our students of color may be low income. So when you look at all the deficit ideologies of the different groups, you start to see that society harbors multiple deficit ideologies about certain groups of students. And then what I have them do as an offshoot of that is come up with ways to combat these deficit ideologies that they've listed on their chart. So that's another way to, sorry, if you could go back one. That's another way to help them see what people may believe about certain groups of people. And then tapping their funds of knowledge should be situated in reality. The example that I gave you earlier with them doing a research project on their home language and culture, incorporating students' knowledge and skills in the classroom is important, and perhaps having them study a topic of interest to them. There was someone in the audience who said, I think they teach statistics, is it statistics? And they were here too. So finding out maybe what some of your students feel is interesting to them, and then applying statistics to having them look at it through that lens for your course content, but studying a topic of interest to them that's relevant to the course content. And then last but not least, this is just ways to interrupt bias. Identify and consciously acknowledge real group and individual differences instead of just applying a blanket statement to a certain group. Cultural X-ray activity that you all did, that's a way that you can interrupt biases, because then you start to clearly see how people judge us based on the exterior labels. And then student questionnaire, asking your student, who are you? What do you like? How do you get to school? Just different questions. Building relationships with students outside the classroom, and learning to question and suspend assumptions and judgments. I just heard a quote, and it said, implicit biases become explicit action. So when we harbor these beliefs about certain groups of people, it may cause us to do things like call the police when there's no need to call the police. So just really learning to question and suspend assumptions and judgments about people. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Can you guys hear me? Bueno, ¿cómo están todos? Buenas tardes. ¿Está buena la comida? ¿Y la conversación? Muy bien, muy bien. That's a very nice joke for me to start with Spanish. Some people really want to get into it, and some other people are like, oh my gosh, is this supposed to be bilingual? Let me read this. Am I in the right place? But it's a good opportunity for you guys to check Are you thinking slow? Are you thinking fast when I do something like that? So, but anyhow, I'm Lilian Baeza Mendoza, and I am a senior professorial lecturer at the World Languages and Cultures here at AU, and I've been teaching here for 10 years or so, quite a while. It's incredible. And in addition to teaching here, I teach Spanish, some translations, some Spanish studies. I also serve as the Associate Director of the Spanish Language Program, together with my colleague and director, Luis Cerezo. Since that program is quite big, so we figure just we need all the help we can get to make sure we accommodate students. So what I wanted to do is that follow up with the conversation that both Amanda and Tracy started with wonderful examples and tips for us to think about as educators. And what I want to give you is basically my own testimonial of what I have done or what I have observed in both in the capacity of an administrator but also an instructor, not as a way of giving you a solution, but as a way of hopefully giving you some food for thought so you can apply into your own conversation with students. So I'm going to move over here because I don't see very well. So that's the truth. So what I want to start with is my role a little bit as an administrator, again, as a position of associate director of the program, and what I see there and some things that we actually have changed on the way we place students, okay? So what I want to tell you is a little bit about what we do when we have a student undergrad, for example, that would like to take Spanish classes. And as other subjects, like math, for example, we do placement testing, and depending on the score, the student gets placed into different levels, right? That is pretty standard thing to do. There's nothing wrong with that. But what we have found over the course of several semesters is that we were not keeping in mind the cases for heritage students, Spanish heritage students, that have learned Spanish in a completely different way than a student that is just seeking learning Spanish as a second language. So what we saw at the beginning is that WebCape exam was a good starting point, but it was not enough. So through a lot of observation and through a lot of one-on-one with students, we realized that it's time for us to take a look exactly at what the student is coming from and see the student case by case, okay? So again, we're talking about the language placement, the student activities and bias, and then we thought, well, we have the score, but that's all we have. But we want to create courses that are more tailored to their needs. But at the same time, although we have the best intentions to do that, it seems like we will still tell them what the classes should look like. But instead of that, what we decided to do is becoming, together with other colleagues, Gorky Cruz is going to talk more about that, and also Chip Gerfen, that we only needed to do part of the work. We would really wanted to include in that creation of those courses, it was the voice of those students and their own experiences. And it was important for us because obviously we're teachers, but we also need to learn how to be students and learners. We need to learn from our students. And through that dynamic, we can actually create, hopefully, a better curriculum and a better safe place for them. So what happened with here is that there's two things in this process. First, we have multiple discussions with our peer colleagues before each semester, and we discussed what do we do when we have students that we don't know exactly where to place, because we want to help them out. And we talked about checking our own bias about that. I always tell them, if the person is Pepito Perez, right, and shows up, don't assume that the person speaks Spanish. Don't assume that students speak Spanish, okay? Let's start asking a few questions about their background before you make that conclusion. Or don't base the proficiency of the student just by the score alone, okay? So just by having that conversation with our peers together, hopefully we come out with better solutions or at least awareness of what we're doing. So what we realize at the same time that we are trying to collectively check our own bias as an exercise, but we also realize that students come with their own bias about their own experiences. And that is something that we did not think about it in the past, but now we just really think about it a lot because the student sometimes, a heritage student, for example, thinks, well, my Spanish is not the best. I want to improve it. I make it better. I don't speak well, okay? And those are all negative remarks about their own experiences. And that's what I think, for example, what Tracy was mentioning about the ginger individual, right? Individual, that their own student is making that assumption, okay, based on when the student hears and thinks societies think of them, right? So that's very complicated and fascinating. So keeping all those things in mind, what we decided to do is basically creating our own place for these heritage students, okay? But at the same time, that place is not imposed, and we use self-identification for that. In other words, we don't tell them, hey, you know, Pedro, you are a heritage student. You need to get out of this class and move to another one. It's through a conversation with each student is that when they decide or make them realize where their place is. And I think that's what I take more from the conversation. Thank you. So moving from self-identification to external classification, again, the process that we do right now is very informal, but at the same, it's pretty constant, is that when we don't know what to do with a situation or a student, instead of ask them to do a test, for example, they talk to an instructor. They talk to Gorky or the instructor where they're enrolled in, and we have a conversation with the student. And through that conversation, again, we don't impose our own ideas about their own identity. Through the conversation that we were hoping that we get is that they realize when they really should be for their own benefit, okay? Seems like very complicated, but knowing our students is actually quite a wonderful experience because as an instructor, I can see what the grammar issues are, but it's really relevant. What I'm looking for is that conversation with the students. I think that's very important. So going back, thank you, Gorky. What we do is that instead of giving them a test, we just ask them a few questions, and we just wrote some questions down for you as a sample. Obviously, each instructor does a different thing, but as you can see, what we want to do here is eliminate anything that is negative, okay? And we want them to think that the situation is a plus, not a minus. They're not lacking skills. They're not lacking skills. They just need to identify what they would like to explore more, but with the assumption that it's good. And that is very hard for the student themselves to understand. They're trying to discover who they are as we speak, right? So do you understand Spanish, but you would like to communicate in Spanish the same way you communicate in English? We don't say, oh, your Spanish is no bueno, right? We don't say it's not good. We say, would you like that same ability? Okay, for example, do you speak some Spanish at home with your parents? Abuelitos, they don't say grandparents, abuelitos, okay? Tell me a little bit, how is your upbringing bring you to this class? Have you studied in the United States? That's pretty straightforward because we want to see if the student identifies himself or herself or themselves as a native speaker, okay? Or maybe as a bilingual, or monolingual, I'm not sure, okay? Through these questions, they start to explore. And do you seek to learn Spanish not as a foreign language? Since you understand and speak it, we know that. We know it's good. We know this, you know this. But because you feel you might benefit from being in a space where you can use the advantage, and that to me is key, the advantage you have to move from one language or culture to the next. Again, by just asking just simple question, we're telling them, we understand you, we get you. It's actually quite amazing that you can move from one language to the next, and you can move from one culture to the next. That's a good thing, okay? So just shaping the kind of questions you ask in your subject or during the conversations that allow students to tell their own experiences with you instead of assuming or trying to channel those thoughts into a right or wrong answer. Okay? Okay, so going back to classes themselves, as I said before, Gorky will speak to you more about this initiative that we have going on about Heritage Spanish students. But I'm going to tell you briefly a little bit about the skeleton of what these courses would look like in the process of revamping it into 4 classes for heritage students. Right now we have 2 and 1 in the oven, okay? So we're in the process of doing that. But I wanted to share with you some descriptions or characteristics of how these courses would look like, okay? Hopefully it's an example of how we perceive the creation of a safe, non-judgmental classroom for these types of students. Again, remember, these students would feel very awkward to go to a normal Spanish course when we teach Spanish as a second language, but if you move to a class that is pretty advanced, they also feel awkward because they don't feel they have the ability to keep up with the reading, with the grammar, with the expression in written form, for example. So these are some examples or some parts of the description of this initiative. Bilingual transcultural identities, advantage instead of a drawback. And it's something that we need to constantly check and make sure we convey that to students. It's good. You are good. You are good. You are full. You're full. Okay? Cultural enrichment and empowerment. Okay? And it means is not everybody has the same experiences, but every experience is important. Okay? And as an instructor, we're there to help shape the discussion, the safe space, but that discussion cannot happen with just one student or just the teacher, okay? Solidarity of experience afforded by the other members of the cohort. Students are co-creators, and this is what we just got from this experience. When we are not just the person that has the knowledge, they also have the knowledge. We want to learn from them, and together through that conversation, the class emerges. It's inclusive. That's what we aim for, right? Students are co-creators, you learn from them too, and they learn from themselves, right? Academic, intellectual space just for them when they feel that are included. They're part of the conversation, they're welcome. It's not about politeness, they belong there. And it's very hard to, for some students to understand, so that's what we strive to support. Solidarity of experience, a place that is tangible for them, again, through the courses tailored just for their own benefits, right? And or horizontal rather than vertical approach, which means is that we are learning from one another. I'm not there to lecture them and tell them who they are. They know who they are. Now I want them to self-discover more, okay? And I would be happy to participate, be part of that conversation, but I'm not there to dictate who they are. Okay? Yeah. And that's it, right? Okay, thank you.
All right, I'll be quick, I promise. My name is Gorky Cruz. I'm also in the Department of World Languages and Cultures, and I run the Language Center, CLEAR. I know that what we want to do also out of this is we want to think about it, we want to be more aware, but we also want to take we want some takeaways, right? So I am going to share a little bit of like some things that we have done in these courses that Lillian just introduced to you, so that you can take something a little bit more concrete back with you. And I do understand also that because we teach so many different things, we are not necessarily, not everything is going to apply to everybody. And of course, we're also not experts on this, but we are sort of jumping into the conversation and sort of contributing what we do know that's being working in our classes in hopes that, it will get you thinking and that hopefully you can adapt it somehow to what you do. All right? So how many people walked up to the buffet when you came in and saw the tortillas and thought, tacos? Right. And how many of you walked in here and saw the panel set up and thought, they're going to sit there and they're going to talk to each other behind the table? Yeah? Not so many? Right. So one of the things that I want you to consider is, I was listening to an interview they did with the president of Towson University about a year ago. And one of the things that he said that really resonated with me, he brought up this concept of the new 3 R's. You guys know what the old 3 R's are, right? Reading, writing, arithmetic, something around that like. But he was saying, the new 3 R's, and basically he was coming from a place where he was describing this is a brick and mortar university, and why would people want to make the sacrifices that they do in order to join in and be in a brick and mortar university. And he said, well, we have to think about what we are giving the students, right, and why they will come here. And that's kind of like where American is in a way too, like expensive, big university, we're all here, staff, and professors who want to contribute to the students' way in life, right? And so he's talking about relationships, resilience, and reflection, right? So when we were talking about this specific framework, I decided that I would present some of the ideas and the things that we have done within that frame, right? So, yes. So as you noticed in the previous photo, the students are working with each other and they're, they have pushed up their desks and they're working with each other. And one of the things that we're a little bit challenged on, and I don't know, how many people have having issues with this. Unfortunately, it's not something that we can necessarily control, not right away in any case, is the physical surroundings, because those make a difference, right? And sometimes we're assigned a classroom and that's what we have to work with, right? So you're teaching a class with 17 students and you walk in there and the tables are all lined in a half square and there's a big desk up front and that's where you sit, right? So the moment you're walking into the classroom, you're already assuming there's a power dynamic, right? That's basically places you in a position of power. The students are sort of sometimes those rows are way, way back. So you're kind of all lonely sitting up there, right? None of the furniture moves, right? So it's very difficult to encourage in-class exchanges. Sometimes I ask my students in my Spanish class, the regular Spanish class and the L2 class, get up and, let's mix. Let's sit next to somebody different. Let's do this activity as a group. But, and they actually do mind. They don't want to. I really had to push them. I don't know if it's because it's 11:20 in the morning and they haven't had lunch yet, but they are really against that. They don't like it and they start picking everything up. And I said, no, just leave your stuff there. It's not going to go anywhere. I just need you to move next to your classmate. And that, for some reason, that gives them pause. And I think it's already because they're coming in with this perception, right? So as we saw, we have all of these constructs in our minds, right? As a linguist, as an applied linguist, I love that because that's how we learn language, right? We systematize. I give you a lot of examples, and then you make an assumption on how everything works, right? So in some senses, it's positive to have, but in other senses, where it comes to bias, it can be a little bit dangerous, right? So here you can see a classroom. One of the things that we have within the department, which is kind of like a luxury, within CLEAR, we have our own classroom, right? We have one classroom and one conference room that we get to set up whichever way we want. And so this is in the old CLEAR, which is in Ashbury, now we're in Anderson. But as you can see, one of the things that we did is we laid out some money to get some movable desks and make the classroom a little bit more elastic, right? So flexible, people could move around. You can see also that the teacher's desk is still there, but it's not centered, right? So that these were all very calculated decisions to see how things will work and how people will behave. We also tried to put a little bit more color around, and there, you can see there's pictures on the wall. Those are pictures of students who have used that classroom or have attended events within the center. And we thought it was important for them to see all sorts of different people who work there and who learn there and who teach there, because there's also pictures of professors, right? And it's a way to reflect, right? And also change perceptions. It seems like a very small thing. It will almost seem like it doesn't really matter. But when you see yourself reflected in your surroundings, it also gives you that sense of belonging that we are sort of like looking for. You identify also with some of those pictures, even if it's not you, right? So that's one of the things that we've been sort of like, we try to have that class, the class for the heritage speakers, happen in a classroom that we can control, so that we can surround them with an environment that's more conducive for them to open up and work together, raising positive awareness of their differences and similarities. So we're going from a place, like this will be like the first step, right? If you somehow, you have the flexibility to sort of rearrange the classroom sometimes, not every day, but maybe occasionally, that can work wonders. Also asking people to mix with each other now and then, right? That's kind of like a very basic entry level thing to do, right? So the second step, like going from there, like once you have that and you have people sort of mixing and you have that friction happening, that it won't necessarily happen under normal circumstances if you kind of like let things run on their own. We want to build a safe classroom, right? In the sense of where people feel protected and they feel that they can voice their opinions or voice disagreements in a civil manner, in a civil environment, right? So this is what I'm talking about here when we're saying creating a classroom culture. Obviously, a lot of us have classroom policies, right? How many of you have some sort of classroom policy that you apply? Right, and there's different things. Like mine is pretty much, you could say like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas kind of thing. Like once we close the door, we assume that you're gonna be very mindful of what's been shared with you. And that seems to work well because as the semester progresses, like relationships are developed, right? And people feel more and more comfortable to share all sorts of different things, right? So this is what we're going after. We're going after this resilience, right? The ability for the students to stand up there and say, and this is super important because how many times do we have a class of 17 and you're like doing double object pronouns and you're like going with it. And I've done this a million times, I love it, right? And then you're like, everybody got it? Does anybody have any doubts? Any questions whatsoever? You got it, right? And nobody says, crickets, right? Right? For whatever the concept is. It could be economics, it could be statistics, right? And everybody's like, because they don't want to be the one, they don't want to be vulnerable, they don't want to put themselves out there. So it's very difficult to get to that point. But that's actually one of the things that we really underscore for them, that it's okay to be wrong, that if you didn't make any errors, we won't be able to learn, right? That errors are a normal part of the learning cycle. And it's okay to step up because you may be doing a favor for another 5 people who are confused, who don't dare, raise their hand and say, hey, could you go over that again because I didn't get it, right? And that's part of like building that resilience, saying it's okay, maybe things are not going great right now, but I'm gonna get some help, or I'm gonna get some supplement to kind of be able to do my work, and that's fine because that's what I need to do. I'm a busy person. Some things may be difficult for me, and I need some help. I'm gonna go get it, and that's normal. That's what I should do, right? So in a way, it ties in with everything that we offer, right, to support the students. And sometimes you wonder, why don't you come to office hours, or why don't you go to the ASAC center, the tutoring or the coaching? Why don't you take advantage of that, right? And sometimes, like, we think it's a matter of time, that they don't have enough time, which is a lot of the time that's true. But sometimes it's this thing that it's up to a way stigmatized, that you need help. And I tell them, no, this is supplemental, this is not remedial. Remedial is when you like end up there like the week before finals cramming because you have no idea what's going on, right? So we're trying to build up towards that, building that resilience. That also happens, could you go back please? Again, one of the things that my colleagues have brought up this afternoon, which is like you honor the student experience, right? You know that, like we say in Spanish, cada cabeza es un mundo, every head is a world, right? And people are bringing all sorts of knowledge, right? So everybody's bound to be an expert on something out there, right? And so you make that important, that explicit, right? And you draw from that. And also, awareness of vulnerabilities of each other and, the instructor. One of the things that you probably can tell from looking at me is like I'm deaf, right? So throughout my life, generally, I sort of adapted really well. And even my parents didn't notice for a while that I had gone deaf, because I will sort of, and it's on one side. So this is this. If you speak to me, if you see me running down the campus and you say, "Hey, Gorky," and I ignore you completely, it's not that I'm ignoring you. Probably didn't hear you, right? So I kind of like learn to like sit a certain way and just kind of cock my head a certain way so that I could interact, and people more likely, if I don't tell them, they don't know, right? But in the classroom, I have to come clean, and I have to tell them, because sometimes, like if you are in a language classroom and the professor keeps on telling you, please repeat, you can interpret that many different ways, right? Like, am I doing it wrong? Is it wrong? So you repeat again, but very timorously, right? But if you know that the person, can hear well, so I tell them at the beginning, I happen to be deaf, so when I ask you to repeat something and to speak loudly, it's not because you're doing things wrong, it's because, you're helping me. I potentially didn't hear you, right? So that also kind of builds, I know it seems like a minor thing, and, there's like, you want to be choosy about what you share, right? Obviously. But that also kind of puts you in that vulnerable spot, right? And sometimes they do appreciate that, and they tend to open up a little bit more with you. So it kind of like works all around in a way. I'm gonna move on to the last one because we're a little bit short on time. So then we, once we have like the people are building those relationships, and one of the things that I love about the heritage class is like a lot of students actually are looking for other Spanish speakers that are on the same boat. So again, they're coming from this point where like they think that their Spanish is not good enough because they go on vacation over summer somewhere overseas and their cousins are like, your Spanish is funny, right? It's a different variety of Spanish, right? So we make them more aware of that. But also they want to be with people who resemble them. And so that's one of the draws for the class. But it's really interesting to see as the semester progresses that all these little relationships develop, right? So in order to encourage that, we have a buddy system. We encourage people to, you don't have your book or you lost it. Be sure that you have somebody that you can get the book from. Something as simple as that, and then they end up having coffee together. And then they go like, oh, we went and checked out a new restaurant this weekend. So every time we meet, I ask them, what's been going on. And you see like relationships developing, which is like, great because they support the resilience factor in the class. And eventually we get to the reflection. So I'm going to be very quick about this. And I decided to bring this up because it was quite eye-opening for me, right? So we, in this particular class, we do many different kinds of things. So they do read things. Sometimes they watch videos or they watch segments from movies and whatnot. They also listen to a lot of podcasts, right? So it's all mixed. So they do all sorts of different things. And then they come back to the class and they discuss, or they actually make their own recording where they comment on things that they found interesting about the podcast. So I decided to go with this Radio Ambulante podcast, and they're like, I think like the only Spanish podcast that comes out of NPR. They started out on their own, and then NPR picked them up. And it's great production values. They go all over Latin America, so you hear all sorts of dialects and accents and whatnot. And I happened to pick this one that was called the Gray Area. And I picked it up because it had something to do with science, and I figured a lot of people who do humanities, kind of like you put something about science in front of them and they freak out. I'm talking even like to grad students, right? So they do international service, and then suddenly you put something about, the history of like vaccinations, and they just shut down, So I was like, okay, let's pick something that we generally don't see in Spanish or literature class. Let's talk about biology and genetics and whatnot. What this is about is actually about mental health, because they're looking at, if you can inherit diabetes or you can inherit, heart disease from your parents, can you inherit mental health issues or mental, is there like chromosomes or genes that are connected to how we develop diseases that are related to mental health, right? And so I thought we were going to have a conversation about that and just kind of like just stay within the text and see, okay, I found this interesting or not. Surprisingly, because of how comfortable this particular group felt with each other, it became a conversation about what people had experienced within their families, right? So they were able to open up enough to sort of say, and recognize it's like, yeah, it's weird. I never realized, because you talk about, abuelita got gout, or like, grandpa got sciatica, but we never talk about this. And then again, we have another layer on that, which is in Hispanic society, there's like certain things that you don't talk about. and they have a very keen awareness of that, and they say, no, in my family we would never, ever like talk about this sort of thing. So,
So Gorky, I hate to
Yep.
cut you off, but we are at time,
Yep.
and we have 1 minute left, and I just want to take that minute to thank all these colleagues, but also to ask that each of you do one thing. We know that unconscious bias is in fact about our habits. So with all these amazing ideas in your brain, I wonder if before we go, you can take the remaining 1 minute we have and write down for yourself somewhere you're going to come back to. So not on a piece of paper you'll lose, right? But somewhere that is it your phone? Is it your what? Where would you come back to something? And think about one habit in your teaching practice that you could really change tomorrow that would help you become more inclusive. One thing. What is one habit you tend to do in your teaching that you could shift in a real way that would actually work in your context and that you feel like is reasonable for you to commit to, because it's changing those habits that ultimately help change those outcomes. So just maybe take 30 seconds and write it down somewhere. Email it to yourself on your phone. Okay, good. Oh, we do. Okay, good.
Time to stay and ask questions of the panel. Please feel free to do that. We still have some food left, and so are there any questions for the panelists before you go? Donald, and then you next. All right. So we'll go with Don.
Hi. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for your comments, your ideas, your pedagogy, so to speak. My main question really is about larger context beyond implicit bias. A lot of what I'm hearing is very practical, sort of in the classroom sorts of things, but my own approach as a historian and teaching a lot of the classes revolves around acknowledging the power dynamic, not just the power dynamic that I have as an instructor, but the power dynamic that allows us to have the implicit or unconscious bias in the first place. A dynamic that involves, you know, systemic racism, or involves sexism, or involves, you know, gender bias or sexual identity bias and so on. And I feel like while we kind of talk a little bit about power, we talk about it in small piece sorts of ways. You know, I guess my question is, what do you recommend to deal with the larger P that gets into the whole issue of implicit bias in the classroom?
I mean, I'll say I think that's really key, and that the impact of our implicit biases is not created equal, right? So the impact of the enactment of those biases has very differential outcomes, right, for us and for our students. So I think that's sort of what I would say. How we respond to it, I think, has got to be systemic, right? It's got to be in our classrooms, but also beyond, right? And so I think that piece of it is at least from where I sit, part of what this plan is about is how do we do this as an organization and not just sort of as a set of individual teachers in our own classrooms, but how do we think about it sort of more structurally? So that would be one sort of idea I'd give. I don't know about the rest of y'all.
In a way, I guess, like, and this might not necessarily address your question directly, but part of it, I think that I'm a person that sort of believe at the basis that, you know, controlling things that I can control and kind of letting go at some point of things that I cannot control necessarily. So that's where I'm departing from me personally, right? So what I do firmly believe is that bringing that awareness, right? Having my students, at least that small group that gets to spend that semester with me, year in, year out, to think about and reconsider why all of these things, all these structures exist, right? To really get engaged to the point of like questioning why that is so, and sort of recognizing so that maybe down the road they're actually going to speak up whenever they see something that shouldn't be that way and say, hey, have you considered that that's not cool or that's not right? Have you considered that there's other ways to do this? So just changing that perspective, and I think that actually it radiates, right? So if I'm doing a little bit, I'm sure that other professors and other faculty are doing their bit as well, and I think that it's not like a catch-all sort of solution, but it's a start, and I think like it's important also to just kind of get it started. So I know that it can be frustrating to see that things are in place and they're difficult to change. It's even more frustrating when you start like kind of like being really aware of all the sorts of trappings and structures are out there. At the same time, I think it's very freeing to be able to sort of like call them out and see them, because sometimes like it's so ingrained that we don't even realize some of these constructs that surround us. So that's my take on your question.
Hi, I'm John Yonner. I'm an adjunct instructor, public speaking and communications. And can I go back to your gingerbread person? So to get to the inside, you say, is very important. I get that. But how do you do it without invading privacy, being intrusive, or on the other side, oversharing and being creepy?
So I was just listening to Gorky when he was talking about the 3 R's and the new R's, and we were talking about like relationships, rigor, and relevance were the R's that from the past. And I was just thinking about this whole idea of relationships, and it's going to have to be built around building relationships with the students, because some students are not going to be as forthcoming with information like sharing. Culturally, some students are told by their parents for many reasons, like don't share information outside of the house. When you were saying that, it resonated with me because based on for survival purposes, throughout the years, African American students aren't as forthcoming with inside information to outsiders because our survival was dependent upon it. So I think building relationships with the students is going to get to that inner piece as well. But what I think is the real aha moment or eye-opener for me when I actually did that activity is that I was making my assumptions to the detriment of my students on what was on the exterior. And so I couldn't really help them until I knew what was really on the interior. So it's not going to be easy because, again, all students won't be forthcoming. But I think if you genuinely work to build a relationship with them and validate and affirm their cultural assets and knowledge, then they will probably be more forthcoming to you with information and asking for assistance maybe when they struggle.